Good morning. My name is Susan Shaheen, and I'm joining you from the University of California, Berkeley. I'm delighted to spend some time with you. I grew up in Rochester. I went to college and university there. And since then, I've become an expert in shared mobility and disruptions in the innovative mobility space. And I'm thrilled to be speaking to you at the Mobility Innovation Summit today. There's many challenges that face us in transportation, and Rochester is a medium-sized city. And I'm inspired by the work of the city, the nonprofits, the metropolitan planning organization there, and shared mobility experts that are working together to try to solve problems and filling the gaps in the transportation network and providing us with a more sustainable transportation system. I'm a professor here in civil and environmental engineering, and I co-direct a center on transportation sustainability. It's called the Transportation Sustainability Research Center. And today I'm going to share with you some insights from a recent paper that we published looking at public transit, and is it time for a public transit renaissance? Today I'll talk about innovations that are disrupting mobility, what's changing and what's not changing, trends and risks that are potentially impacting the public transportation system across the United States, areas that we may want to rethink, and I'll conclude with guiding principles for public agencies. In this slide, you can see a number of the innovations that are disrupting mobility. Some may be common to you and some may not be common to you. The slide features pictures of drones, urban air mobility vehicles, and also automated cars. In the next slide, I focus on the shared mobility ecosystem, and a lot of you may be new to this concept. Essentially, shared mobility is use and access of a vehicle on a short-term basis. Essentially, what people are doing is they're trading off from the fixed costs of auto ownership to a more variable cost associated with a particular form of trip making. This ecosystem diagram shows you how vast shared mobility options are. One of the key things that I wanted to point out to you is that public transportation is inherently defined as shared mobility itself. It is not external to shared mobility, along with a number of incumbent modes, including taxis, paratransit, shuttles, car rental, limos. We also see a number of the innovative modes to the right in the blue circle that are infused with information technology. They range from bike sharing to car sharing to courier network or delivery services, e-hail services that are used by taxis, high-tech company shuttles, microtransit, peer-to-peer car sharing, bike sharing, ride sourcing, platforms that are used to source rides, such as Lyft and Uber, also known as transportation network companies, and scooter sharing. And in the middle of the Venn diagram, you see a number of modes that have been with us for a long time that are also being infused with information technology, including carpooling, vanpooling, and casual carpooling. Things are shifting. We're seeing a lot of change, and we're seeing a lot of emerging public-private partnerships that accompany this. Shared mobility is growing across the globe and across the United States, and there's increasing evidence that there's opportunities for smaller cities, medium-sized cities, even rural areas to play with shared mobility in terms of filling gaps in the transportation network. State and local DOTs are leveraging resources with ride sourcing companies, transportation network companies, taxis, and volunteer drivers to address these service gaps. We see the appearance of integrated multimodal travel information apps, which improve our ability to link public and private options together. We're seeing more carpooling and ride-sharing startups that are using information technology to enable high occupancy commuting and travel. Automakers are starting to rebrand as mobility companies. They're acquiring startups and they're pursuing self-driving vehicles. We're also hearing a lot about mobility on demand and mobility as a service in Europe. There's pilots in Finland, Sweden, and the Netherlands. Ultimately, the idea of mobility as a service is to culminate into a package type service where people have unlimited travel within a month's time frame for a certain price. In the next slide, I show the growth of on-demand and flexible route services. So we're seeing a lot of developments in the area of microtransit, You see an image here of Via. There's another microtransit service called Chariot. There's Uber and Lyft, the transportation network companies. We also see the carpooling companies like Waze Carpool and Scoop featured here. In the next slide, I show a histogram of the growth in car sharing. And this image shows both round-trip car sharing and one-way car sharing. So that's going from point to point rather than returning the vehicle to the same location. With respect to these data, what we show is ongoing growth in this sector, with January 2017 reporting 1.9 million members of car sharing programs in North America. In the next slide, I show the car sharing vehicle growth trends, and you can see a collective fleet of over 24,600 vehicles being deployed throughout North America to support those car sharing members. So this is evidence of the growth of shared mobility, although there's many other forms of shared mobility, as I mentioned earlier. The next slide, I want to talk about what's changing and what's not. And one of the things that we found in our research is that suburbanization is really not changing. In fact, the U.S. population is still trending towards suburbanization today. 75% of households reside in single-family or mobile homes, according to the U.S. Census. There's growth in employment centers, which has been occurring outside of the urban core for some time, and in various suburban nodes such as edge cities. Between 1990 and 2010, suburbs generally grew faster than urban cores. So I want to underscore that suburbanization is still a trend, and we should expect to have to work with that with our mobility solutions in terms of filling gaps in the transportation network. Next, I'm going to talk about risks confronting public transportation. And these risks are being faced across the United States and the globe. One of the things we hear a lot about is the need to protect public transit riders from crime and terrorism. And these may be deterrents from people wanting to take public transit. We're also seeing demographic shifts and changing modal choice. For example, we're seeing more millennials who want to take shared mobility options and may be moving away from public transit for some of their trip making by using services like microtransit or ride sourcing. We're also seeing a lot of technological innovation, which is creating new demand for real-time information services and rider amenities. And that may also include on-demand and more flexible connections to public transit, like first mile and last mile. We're also seeing discussions about labor and possible security risks and how they may slow or limit innovation in public transit innovation. Rising transit fares can also affect people's willingness to take public transit, particularly if transit fares are more expensive than other options. Many public transit systems are in serious need of maintenance and repair, and they may not have the dollars that they need to repair the services quickly enough or to grow their services quickly enough. And then finally, there's competition with the private auto in terms of low fuel prices and auto use. So all of these things are affecting public transit and changing our view towards what we may need to do in order to encourage more use of public transit and growth in this sector. Areas to rethink. In the next slide, I show an image which shows shared mobility and public transit and opportunities to bring these two services together. They include first mile, last mile connectivity, public transit enhancement or even replacement, so filling those gaps or getting rid of ineffective bus lines, providing late night transportation where it may not have been provided in the past or improving the quality of those services. Paratransit is another opportunity, and others may exist as well. In the next slide, I show a quadrant diagram that I've recently constructed, and there's essentially two vectors. On one vector, you see high density built environment and low density built environment. And then on the second vector, you see a temporal scale that represents high levels of service and low levels of service of transit. And what I think is important to note is in that upper right quadrant, that's where there's potentially the most competition with public transit of shared mobility services. And we might want to think about constructing policies to optimize the complementarity between public transit and shared mobility, particularly in that case. In the other quadrants, there's many opportunities, I think, for cities to provide connectivity when there is not as much density or as much service availability. And so I think there's less competition opportunities and far more opportunities to complement public transit. Right sizing is really important. And so when we're thinking about this, we could downsize the scale of the bus, possibly providing a sedan or a microtransit style vehicle. These types of partnerships with public transit are really important, I think, to the next renaissance of the public transportation system. The metropolitan planning organizations will have a key role in that, as well as public-private partnerships. One thing that's really important for us to think about as we plan for this new future are the equity challenges we might face. And some common equity challenges include not having a smartphone or the data plan to go along with it. Some people may be unbanked or underbanked and will not be able to pay for these services via a smartphone or app. Some individuals simply cannot afford these services because they are lower income. And there may be a lack of service availability in some neighborhoods and for low-income individuals. So we have to be cognizant of that. We also have to be aware that there's people with disabilities who may not be able to access them due to a visual or hearing impairment or some other physical disability. So when planning for shared mobility in medium-sized cities or in rural areas, or even in these urban dense cores, we argue that we should be thinking about equity across all of these factors so that we're really getting our solutions right. In the next slide, I'm sharing with you research that we've done over the last decade that indicates from our work on car sharing and docked bike sharing systems, transportation network companies, and microtransit, that the vast majority of the users are Caucasian. They typically earn a lot of money compared to low-income individuals, and individuals earning less than $35,000 a year are a minority in these data sets. We also find that the vast majority of users of shared mobility currently are very highly educated. And in fact, in one particular study we conducted, 100% of the participants had a 4-year degree or higher. And with respect to age, it may not surprise you that users of these systems tend to be younger. Although we're seeing some changing dynamics, we do need to be cognizant of these possible dividers as we plan for shared mobility connections to public transit. In the next slide, I present the STEPS Transportation Equity Framework that we recently put together in concert with the U.S. Department of Transportation. STEPS stands for spatial, temporal, economic, physiological, and social. We feel that it's very important to take each of those steps into consideration when you're planning your partnerships and your integration of shared mobility with public transit. It's very important that neighborhoods with similar densities and built environments should have equal access and equivalent level of service. And so as we plan, we really also need to be cognizant that we have to provide equivalent service. That means the same transportation modes, the same hours and frequency of service, and comparable wait times. And this is not easy. So there's this opportunity to use the STEPS framework and shared mobility to resolve a number of these inequities. I'd like to conclude with some guiding principles and some final thoughts. Shared mobility impacts everyone, not just its users. We need to have clear and consistent definitions that can help to clear any confusion about the modes and service models. There is confusion about what is car sharing or what is carpooling or what is ride sharing. So it's important to use consistent definitions. Public agencies should really embrace public-private collaboration and testing and experimentation. Public participation is key to involving the individuals that could be using these systems and listening to their concerns for implementing the services. Public agencies should consider collecting data and consider compulsory reporting requirements to anyone using the rights-of-way. Incorporation of shared mobility into transportation planning and long-range planning is very critical. Many models do not account for shared mobility at present, and this is something that's very clearly going to be part of our future. Public agencies should also ensure social, interregional, and intergenerational equity in meeting their basic transportation needs of travelers. It's very important to integrate public transit and state climate action plans to unlock benefits in smaller-sized cities of shared mobility and to also unlock the benefits to disadvantaged and vulnerable populations. It's very important to track the growth and the impacts of shared mobility and to manage the rights of way in accordance with those impacts, and to guide the public-private partnerships that support shared mobility. Providing open data allows public agencies the ability to offer real-time transportation information to their communities without the cost and responsibility or maintaining mobile applications. Public agencies could establish data exchanges to serve as a repository for holding public and private sector data sets. And finally, the public and private sector should continually develop and enhance policies that protect user data privacy. It's important to remember that location data are just as sensitive as financial and demographic data. So before I leave you, I want to share with you opportunities to catch up on innovative mobility and to follow the latest developments and research. You can subscribe to our weekly newsletter here. And to receive our updates, you merely need to go to our website and subscribe at the bottom. The next slide shows a number of our recent resources, which are available to you to download for free from our Shared Mobility resource page, available at imr.berkeley.edu, and also at the various web links I've provided. The next slide also shows a number of additional resources that might be of interest to you. A Future of Mobility white paper that is setting the stage for looking out to 2050 with the California Transportation Plan, and a Mobility on Demand Concept of Operations report that the U.S. Department of Transportation has recently released. And then finally, you may be interested in a book I've recently published in 2017 on disrupting mobility. And with that, I'd like to wrap up this presentation. Wish you all the best for your summit. I'd like to acknowledge Rochester for your leadership. I'm really excited to see you grow and develop. And as a Rochesterian, I think it's tremendously exciting to see you venturing into this space. And I'd also like to acknowledge Rachel Heckel and Creighton Randall of Shared Mobility, Inc., and thank them for inviting me to join you today.